Welcome to Barry's In the Interim podcast, where we explore the cutting edge of innovative clinical trial design for the pharmaceutical and medical industries, and so much more. Let's dive in.
All right, welcome everybody. Welcome back to In the Interim. We investigate all things statistical, scientific, medicine, as we may talk a little bit about today, in the world of clinical trial design, innovative clinical trial design. I'm your host, Scott Barry, and I have a wonderful guest today, a good friend of mine, and has been working with and at Barry for a number of years, Dr. Roger Lewis. Sort of a doctor because he's a PhD in biophysics. He's also an MD. He's a professor at the Geffen School of Medicine at UCLA, a member of the National Academy of Medicine, and also a fellow of the ASA. So Roger, welcome to In the Interim.
Great. Well, it's a pleasure to be here.
Yeah. So an interesting topic today, and you're incredibly well experienced and passionate about data safety monitoring boards. And you have a long history of serving on data safety monitoring boards. You've been a member of statistical analysis committees that have presented to them, been all around the world of data safety monitoring boards. So we're going to talk about them, particularly the role in new trial designs, innovative trial designs, adaptive trials, platform trials, the role of the data safety monitoring board. So it'd be wonderful. And so my wife always reminds me that a lot of people watch this and listen to this that may not know all of the details of this. So let's start at the basics. What is the role of a data safety monitoring board in a clinical trial?
So the Data Safety Monitoring Board, which is sometimes called a Data Monitoring Committee, goes by a number of different names, but they're all generally groups of people that are assembled to keep an eye on things as a trial is being conducted and to protect the participants or the volunteers who participate in the trial from avoidable risk. So there's a step before you start a trial where the investigators and all of their collaborators and maybe patient representatives think very clearly about how do we design a clinical trial so we learn and improve the care of future patients, but at the same time, how are we going to protect the patients within the trial? But once the trial begins, those investigators are generally blinded to the accumulating results within the trial, so they don't have insights into what's going on once the process is actually started. The Data Monitoring Committee or the Data Safety Monitoring Board fills that gap and keeps an eye on things when the investigators are not supposed to be looking to avoid biasing or otherwise manipulating the trial results.
So who makes up the Data Safety Monitoring Board? Who might be the members of a typical DSMB?
So a typical DSMB has members who are experts in the clinical medicine or the science of what is being done. They may know a lot about the type of therapy or the usual treatment of patients. There are usually statistical or clinical research design experts who know a lot about the interpretation of accumulating data, because there are some specific challenges to looking at data multiple times as a trial is being conducted. And then sometimes, depending on the context, there may be patient representatives or specialists in the ethical considerations. And in trials that span the enrollment or include the enrollment of patients across multiple geographic areas or settings in which the patients are particularly vulnerable, say they're incapacitated by their illness and can't consent on their own, there may be additional people brought in to bring in the perspectives of those locations.
Oh, interesting. So we may come back to waiver of informed consent and if a DSMB different in a situation like that. So during the trial, largely the Data Safety Monitoring Board are those that are seeing the data. And generally, people may not understand that the investigators, the outside world don't see the data, but the Data Safety Monitoring Board is watching it. You didn't say anything about the role of the Data Safety Monitoring Board or your view on the role of the Data Safety Monitoring Board about the scientific credibility of the trial. So as the trial's going, presumably we're running this trial to answer a question, hopefully more than one question. What do you think the role of the DSMB is in making sure that the credibility of the trial, that it's answering the scientific questions?
Yeah, it's a great question. So when I'm usually asked about the role of a DSMB, I talk about three different levels of responsibility. So the first is to the participants in the trial. So it's to protect those participants from avoidable risk, including risks that could not have been foreseen at the time the trial was designed. The second is to provide an assurance that the scientific integrity, the validity, the credibility of the trial is maintained to the extent that is possible while protecting the participants in the trial. So, for example, in the setting of an adaptive trial, which I hope we'll talk about, there are very specific rules that are in place that must be followed if the design is going to have the operating characteristics, the protection from error rates and bias that we want it to have. The DSMB is one of their responsibilities is to make sure that that trial design is followed as long as that's still consistent with protecting the participants from risk. The third responsibility of the DSMB in the hierarchy, in my view, is to operationalize the sponsor or the investigator's goals with respect to the trial itself. So there are decisions that sometimes have to be made as the trial is being conducted. So, for example, stopping a trial for futility that should take into account all of the different goals scientifically and otherwise with respect to the trial and balance those. That can only happen if the DSMB understands in some depth what those goals were.
So you touched on adaptive trials. I want to talk about the difference of a DSMB and an adaptive trial, and maybe set up that if you're running a trial and the trial design is enroll 100 patients, and then we'll look at the data and do an analysis. The DSMB can follow the data, but they would have to stop it. Otherwise, it runs out to the end. But otherwise, the role of them is monitoring data largely and looking for safety signals. In an adaptive trial, it may be set up now. It has multiple interim analyses. It has adaptive triggers that can happen. Patient populations could be stopped. Randomization could be changed in an adaptive trial. So how is the role of the DSMB now changed?
Yeah, I think it's a great point. So in the traditional trial you design, say, with a fixed sample size, the DSMB is largely looking for safety signals or maybe operational or logistical challenges that weren't foreseen. So problems that weren't anticipated. In an adaptive trial with its various moving parts, the role of the DSMB expands to making sure that the adaptive trial is conducted as it was intended, as long as that continues to be ethically and scientifically appropriate, and most importantly, to understand the difference. So it's one thing to understand how a traditional fixed sample size trial is supposed to be conducted, and it's qualitatively more complicated to understand how a modern adaptive or, say, platform trial is intended to be conducted.
So now, and I'm typically involved on the design side. I have been on DSMBs and I've been a part of them, but I'm typically on a design side. And what we're trying to design is a really efficient design that's going to answer the questions efficiently. It may have stopping rules. We define detailed stopping rules, algorithms, models, and something that we've simulated a great deal. The design, the characteristics of it. You could almost say now this could be run automated within the setting. And so the question is the role of a DSMB there. And by no means am I saying that this should be run without a DSMB, but the role of the humans watching this automated machine go seems entirely different than maybe a DSMB of 10, 15, 20 years ago that was kind of a fixed trial design.
So I think it's the role is expanded. I'm not sure it's different in its intent. So let's take the type of situation that you and I are commonly involved in. It's adaptive design. It has planned interim analyses. There are decision rules based on statistical triggers. So the DSMB should be paying attention to whether the design is being implemented as it was intended. The DSMB should be looking at the characteristics of the incoming data that the design is by design blind to. So most of the adaptive trials that we see, we work on, we see designed by others, generally have the adaptations driven by the primary endpoint of the trial. Now, occasionally we have some that combine efficacy and safety endpoints, for example, in a utility function, but there is a restricted set of data that the adaptive design is responding to. So one of the things the humans should do is pay attention to the other parts of the data stream that the algorithm may be blind to, and make sure that everything still makes sense and is appropriate. Secondly, there are settings in which what happens in real life, unfortunately, falls outside the range of what was simulated. Mm-hmm. So, for example, we may simulate a design that under certain assumptions regarding the accrual rate, and just remind everybody the operating characteristics of an adaptive design that uses incomplete data from patients is that the operating characteristics actually depend on the accrual rate. So let's suppose we have a trial in which the accrual rate is much faster than expected. The DSMB may want to verify that the operating characteristics are still acceptable. So that's an example. So I think there's a general class of situations, which is those unanticipated scenarios in which the operating characteristics of the design may not actually be as well understood as the regions of what might occur that we did simulate well.
So I can imagine being in that situation and sitting on a DSMB and wondering, the algorithm is set up and it might do a predictive probability of success. Should we stop enrollment? What's the predictive probability of success? Or algorithms running. You as the DSMB, I assume you have to know a little bit about how that's functioning, what that probability is, what it incorporates and what it doesn't. So you describe that you need to look at the data that the algorithm can't see. The design didn't incorporate those things. It sounds like there's a whole new skill set to understanding the design, what's involved, what's not. A whole bunch of time spent with the designers before you go under the unblinded part, and you're now by yourselves and you can't really ask many of these questions, and that's harder. So a whole new skill set to sit on a DSMB of more complicated trials.
I think that's right, but I think it's both skill set and process. So we'll do them in that order. The skill set is you need to have people on your DSMB who absolutely understand how the statistics were supposed to work and how they will work if some of the assumptions that we tested carefully turn out not to be true. So, for example, as a general rule, if enrollment is slower than expected, the design's going to work just fine.
Yeah.
And so you don't have to worry about that. Whereas in the other direction, you might or might not have to worry depending on the details. But there's also a process issue, which you alluded to, which is that before the DSMB sees any data, or certainly unblinded data, the DSMB can have open conversations with the people who designed the study, the sponsor, regulatory agencies, and understand the considerations that were taken into account and how the design was developed, how it's supposed to work, and how it was evaluated. Once the DSMB has seen unblinded data, to avoid various types of bias that we may or may not exist very often, but we certainly worry about a lot, the DSMB needs to not discuss any of these details with the investigator team other than through the provision of specific recommendations that are intended to improve the safety or validity or other characteristics of the trial. So all the conversations about how the design was supposed to work and why it was designed that way need to occur up front. And it requires much more preparation before the DSMB, as you say, goes into their cone of silence, if you will.
Yeah.
And I think this is an extension of the expertise that was required with, say, a traditional group sequential design. DSMBs with traditional group sequential designs generally had a statistician who understood that methodology, an alpha spending approach, for example, of an O'Brien-Fleming stopping rule. You needed someone who understood the design. But now the designs are much more complicated, so you need people who not only understand the general theory, but they understand the specific application of the design that you're tasked with overseeing.
Yeah. So we've had we won't mention any names or things, but I've been involved in a design of a trial where we have that initial meeting, and we're talking to DSMB members who, quite frankly, the best way to say is they don't like the design, and they almost want to redesign it before it starts. Oh, I would do this and I would do that, and we've had circumstances where the sponsor has largely said, I don't think you should be a member of the DSMB if you don't like the design. That the role of the DSMB isn't to redesign the trial. So there's some level of acceptance of the design by being on a DSMB. Is that fair?
Oh, I think that's absolutely fair. First of all, I don't think that as someone who serves on a DSMB member, I don't think I should serve on a DSMB if I think it's a bad design, because part of my responsibility is ensuring that design is conducted as it was intended for reasons of scientific validity. On the other hand, none of us like criticism. And, we may work for weeks or months or many months on the design of a trial. And the DSMB does come into the evaluation of that design with a fresh perspective. And there may actually be some really good insights, and the sponsor's response should not be to kick off the dissenters, but to decide to make sure that they aren't that they don't have good points that warrant a reevaluation of some of the characteristics of the design. And I think that that brings us to an interesting point, which has to do with the requirement for DSMB members to be independent financially and scientifically from the sponsor or the product, and hopefully intellectually from folks who are developing the therapy. So, for example, you don't want someone on your DSMB who has spent their entire life developing compounds in class X and then put them on a DSMB of a trial evaluating compound X, because they will want to see it work. And this is not saying that people are dishonest. It's saying that we all have our own biases. And it's those covert biases that I think are the most worrisome, because they're the hardest to account for in what can be quite nuanced discussions about risk and benefit. So the DSMB members are generally people who are scientific experts or medical experts in the clinical area, in general research methodology, in related therapies, but they need to have some level of independence from the actual product development, which is why they may look at a design and there may be things they don't like, but it may also because they have broader insights into likely challenges with the patient population, outcome assessment, safety assessment, and those sorts of things.
Yeah. And point very well taken about there can be huge value brought from the DSMB to that, even in the early design stages of that. Have over the years, and we won't say how many years you've been doing DSMB work, but over the years, given the changes, is there a bit of a clash that people who have been DSMB members in, I'll say, somewhat traditional fixed trial designs jump into an adaptive trial, and it's a different world. It's a different type of trial, and a bit of clash with maybe I won't even say, but the amount of time spent in the review, or the expectations for a DSMB, or the role that they play in what might be a 20 interim analysis adaptive trial that they're trying to follow.
So there's lots of growing pains moving people who have experience with traditional approaches into the role of oversight of these trials. And I am sure that when we're done with this recording, I will regret not having remembered some of them. So one has to do with the level of preparation. So it is an open secret that many clinical members of DSMBs are picked because they have very high stature in their fields. They have a lot of credibility, and they are very, very busy people. They often show up to DSMB meetings not having spent sufficient time reviewing the reports. And as a separate topic, these reports have just grown in length and complexity. We could spend an entire podcast talking about how damaging that is to the overall safety of the trial. So these people are used to showing up to meetings with insufficient preparation and still be able to make important, meaningful contributions based on their knowledge of the clinical disease and context, and the fact that the trials were quite simple and they could pretty much figure it out on the fly. That's no longer true. And the amount of preparation required before the meetings start, before you see data, and for each meeting is substantially greater, and people may or may not be able to incorporate that into their other demands and their professional existence. There is a commonly observed phenomenon that if you want the best possible review of a grant or a manuscript, the best person for that is someone who's still an assistant professor, because they will spend the time and they will care and they want to make a good impression. And there's some of that truth in DSMB work as well, that the best people to do this are not people who are so well known that they can't devote the time to what's necessary. So that's one area of conflict. A second area of conflict, which I think we really need to touch on, is the difference between a rule and a guideline. So if you look at the what was written in the literature about data safety monitoring boards, for example, as originally envisioned by NIH institutes, a very common paragraph in those publications was that the rules or the stopping rules, say, group sequential stopping rules, were merely guidelines. And it was up to the DSMB to decide when they were appropriate to apply and when they weren't. And in fact, there was an implication that if the DSMB thought it wasn't good to stop so soon, that was just fine and they could just make that decision unilaterally. That view, at least in my opinion, is completely inconsistent with this idea that we want adaptive trials, including group sequential trials, that have defined operating characteristics. If you want a defined operating characteristic where you've simulated the trial under a set of rules, they are rules. And just like other rules...
And by the way, it might say the rule in the protocol. It's in the protocol.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Absolutely. So these pre-specified rules are rules, which doesn't mean they can't be broken, but if they're broken, they need to be broken for very explicit reasons, not because a member has a hunch or is curious what would happen if the trial went a little bit longer, or the member disagrees with the design. It needs to be for a reason like there's a safety signal we didn't anticipate. And then the reasons for deviating from the rule need to be, in most cases, discussed with the sponsor. So one of the big disconnects between DSMB work a couple of decades ago and modern DSMB work adaptive trials is that adaptive trials have rules and they are not merely guidelines if we're going to simultaneously argue that we understand the operating characteristics of these trials.
Yeah. The within that now, with the rules and the trial running, my analogy is that this is like a plane that's flying automatic pilot. It has algorithms that fly the plane, but you have a pilot that's there, and the DSMB is somewhat like the pilot. Now, part of this is you have to have the DSMB there because they need to evaluate the appropriateness of those rules. I could imagine a situation where there's concerns that the data that's going into the algorithm is flawed. There's weird missing data to it. There's concerns that the data is not appropriate. And you might think, I know it's a rule, but I'm concerned that the data is not appropriate. And I don't think the rule is any longer appropriate. That seems very different than I just don't like it, or it would be nice if the trial ran for another year, or as a guideline. That seems, though, really hard for the DSMB to make those judgments, but seems that that's the key role now for them.
Absolutely. And let me give you just a couple of semi-hypothetical examples of those types of considerations. So let's say you have a futility stopping rule, and it's your first interim analysis at which that futility rule can be applied. Let's say the disease in question is a chronic degenerative disease. The first patients who are enrolled in the trial may be from the reservoir of patients with relatively long-standing disease who are waiting for the trial to open up. And therefore, their disease may actually be qualitatively different, more difficult to slow the progression or to intervene on than patients with newly diagnosed disease. In which case, it may be that the futility rule is appropriately interpreting the data, but that the population we expect to enroll later in the trial may actually have a more favorable prognosis. So we're getting the right answer on the wrong population, in which case the rule might not be appropriate. A very similar situation occurs in global clinical trials. If there may be particular geographic areas in which, for example, a surgical procedure may behave differently than in some areas. Obviously, we'd like to have the heterogeneity in the disease process or in the surgical procedure thought out ahead of time so the adaptive design accounts for it. But the DSMB in those cases may be suspicious that the rule is missing an important characteristic of the data stream that really needs to be accounted for.
Yeah. So they're within these adaptive trials, there's also somewhat of a new group, and there always was a statistician who was unblinded to the data that's presenting safety tables. And these tombs of safety tables that they go through. And there was always that role, but this individual was kind of a master of the data and presenting it. Now, in most of these trials, we have statistical analysis committees that are running the models, that are driving the adaptations. The interaction between the DSMB and the statistical analysis committee also seems to be very much of a new thing.
Yeah, absolutely. So as you well know, the Statistical Analysis Committee is an unblinded group who actually run the analyses. So they receive data usually from a data coordinating center. The data they receive have usually gone through the ongoing quality assurance process. And what I mean by that is that they are cleanish, but they are not locked. And the Statistical Analysis Committee then it makes a good faith effort to implement whatever the pre-specified analyses were intended necessary to drive the decision rules. And I think it is a rule rather than an exception that the Statistical Analysis Committee learns things about where the data are more or less consistent, where they are more or less complete, where there may be issues with internal inconsistency in the data that are important to understand to help assess the credibility or the level of assurance we want to place in the results of those interim analyses.
Yeah.
One of the things the Statistical Analysis Committee has a lot of insight into, just to give a concrete example, is you're doing analysis 3, you can see which of the patients in analysis 3 were actually also in analysis 2, but they've had an outcome or, God forbid, even a treatment assignment change since the prior analysis.
Yeah.
And in big trials, those things happen, but it helps us on the Statistical Analysis Committee side understand the level of assurance that we should place in the data.
Yep.
And you can picture a setting in your interaction with the DSMB, especially if something is near a statistical trigger, that the DSMB would appropriately ask questions about the quality of the data
Yep.
that yielded that result.
Yeah. And so then that statistical analysis committee's trying to diagnose the appropriateness of the analysis, the data that went in, and interacting with the DSMB, I imagine back and forth a little bit about that appropriateness when the time comes for a decision or a trigger that is met.
Yeah, I mean, the pattern that we see is that the Statistical Analysis Committee statisticians, singular or plural, present their interim analysis report, which, as you noted, is separate generally from the safety reports and secondary endpoints and all those other reports. They present that interim analysis report to the DSMB, and then they stick around to answer any questions. Usually the DSMB charter allows for the DSMB to then kick the Statistical Analysis Committee out of the meeting. My experience is that usually the Statistical Analysis Committee has very useful insights into the data, and they rarely get kicked out.
Yeah. You know, I forgot to start this off with my layup question for you, which I think we want to get on the podcasts. Should the DSMB be blinded to treatment assignment?
Okay. Yeah. So the DSMB is inherently tasked with balancing efficacy and safety at a very fundamental level, and those considerations are virtually never symmetric. So we will, for example, want to continue a trial that has a good chance of showing that the new treatment is helpful. We rarely want to prove with the same level of certainty that we can hurt people with a new treatment. So given the lack of symmetry, there's absolutely no value whatsoever in blinding the DSMB to treatment assignment at any point in the trial. And just to be clear, my position on this, which I know you anticipated, is what I mean is that every table, figure, comparison presented to the DSMB should explicitly label the treatment arms. No A versus B, no shuffling of them. They should be labeled with the actual name of the treatments so that the DSMB never is confused. There are extraordinarily high-profile cases where DSMBs thought they knew what was going on when they were looking at blinded data. And by blinded in this case, I don't mean aggregated. I mean treatment assignments separated but labeled A versus B, sometimes with that randomized. And the DSMB made bad decisions because they assumed they knew what was going on, but they were wrong. The cardiac arrhythmia suppression trial is the most notable example of that. Yeah. One of my favorite publications on this was an editorial from Curtis Maynard in the New England Journal many years ago, which is entitled Masked Monitoring in Clinical Trials - Blind Stupidity.
Yeah. Okay.
Yeah. That's New England Journal, 1998. He was right then. He's still correct.
So largely, the DSMB should have access to everything in this notion of risk benefit. I maybe you could construct weird cases where there's some efficacy endpoint that's separate, but largely it's a question of, is the risk benefit profile for a patient in the trial still good? And they should have essentially have everything at that they can possibly get data to make those decisions.
I think that's exactly right. Now, I'll give you an example of where people get confused about this. So picture a trial that's going to take a year to get to the first planned interim for efficacy, where the first opportunity for early stopping for efficacy is. But the charter and appropriately so, the committee meets after 6 months. So a common area of confusion is at that first 6-month meeting, should the DSMB see efficacy data? And the answer is yes, they should, just to be clear.
Yep.
Because they will even be balancing efficacy and safety at that 6-month meeting. The confusion is that because there's no opportunity to stop early for efficacy within the design at that first meeting, people sometimes argue it's a safety-only meeting. The reason this is incorrect is because the level of safety concern that the DSMB should appropriately tolerate depends on the benefit that patients are receiving from the therapy or appear to be receiving. You simply cannot separate them.
Yeah. Now, do adaptive designs almost address this more appropriately because the rules are laid out? Maybe there's now 5 interim analysis and it says very clearly you cannot stop at this analysis. Here are the rules. Here they're set up, where maybe historically there was a notion that when the DSMB meets, maybe we'll declare success. And it was a little bit more guideline driven, and there may be thought to be reasons not to show them efficacy. But maybe adaptive designs help that. And of course, in many of these adaptive designs, you can't possibly follow the trial unless you're completely unblinded to treatment assignment because the analyses are.
You know, I think many of these things come up on what I'll call soft considerations, the safety outcomes that are not involved in the primary efficacy analysis, the total burden, those sorts of things. So I'm not sure the adaptive design helps those that much. I think with respect to the direct balance of the primary efficacy on the primary endpoint versus, say, a preconceived primary safety consideration, I think the fact that the adaptive design in general allows you to look in a pre-specified way earlier, I think it does help that. But the fact is that each time the DSMB meets, if patients have been treated within the trial, they should be seeing efficacy and safety data so that they can explicitly balance them.
Yeah. Wonderful. And so the name of this podcast is In the Interim, and we have DSMBs that live their life in the interim, looking at the interim data. Roger, appreciate it. That was fabulous. Thank you for joining In the Interim.
Great. Thank you for having me.
Thanks, Roger.